and I will also answer questions on his behalf.
Questions without notice. The member for Blair has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Veterans Affairs. Can the minister confirm the backlog of 60,000 unprocessed compensation claims for our veterans is a national disgrace, as he told the media on Saturday?
The minister has the call.
Well, I thank the member for his question, and I stand by everything that I said, and I stand by everything that I did. I did so on Saturday, and I stand by it in this House today. Clearing that backlog of claims needs to be a national imperative, and it should be a bipartisan imperative. And that's why
The minister has the call.
That's why, Mr Speaker, we have secured $96 million in this budget and in the budget papers and also the contingency to clear that backlog of claims. And you know why I'm so passionate about it, Mr Speaker? Because we owe it to the ADF personnel, we owe it to veterans, and we owe it to their families. This backlog has been building up for years, but we are doing something about it. And Mr Speaker,
Members on my left. Members on my left. The minister has the call.
You will see in that budget, Mr Speaker, funding to reduce that claim in many different ways, including more staff to get the claims processing system going and to get it fixed and to get it moving. And I don't apologise for it now, and I never will.
The member for Longman has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister please outline to the House how tonight's budget will continue to secure our economy and create a stronger future for all Australians?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Longman for his question. Mr Speaker, he knows and will learn this evening that tonight's budget is a budget that Australians have been working hard for. Over the course of the last 3 years, Mr Speaker, Australians have had to put up with a lot. They've had to sacrifice a lot, Mr Speaker. They've been pushing through, Mr Speaker. They've been dealing with pandemics, with floods, with fires, Mr Speaker. Australians have made great sacrifices. And, Mr Speaker, as we've come through those years working together and pushing through these difficult times, that hard work tonight, Mr Speaker, will be on display in the budget that we're able to deliver, Mr Speaker, which will ensure that, combined with the strong, responsible, Mr Speaker, and effective economic management, that we can deliver for the people of Australia tonight, Mr Speaker. That same economic management that has driven unemployment from 5.7, Mr Speaker, when we came to government, down to 4.7, down to 4.0, Mr Speaker, and falling still below 4% to have a 3 in front of it. That same economic management, Mr Speaker, that through the course of this pandemic has enabled Australia to retain its AAA credit rating, one of only 9 countries to do so, and the list was longer before this pandemic. That same economic management, Mr Speaker, that has ensured that Australia's economy today has around 370,000 more jobs in it than before the pandemic, Mr Speaker. That same economy that has outstripped the performance of the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Mr Speaker, Germany, France and the entire G7. That economic management of this government, Mr Speaker, combined with the hard work and sacrifice of Australians, means that tonight we can ensure that we deliver the support to Australians for the cost of living pressures that they are facing today. And in addition to that, Mr Speaker, and in doing so responsibly and in a targeted and affordable way, Mr Speaker, we also make the investments in Australia's future prosperity with our long-term economic plan that is working. And we know that our economic plan is working because Australians are in work, Mr Speaker, because Australians are in work and unemployment has fallen to 4% in our watch. Under Labor's watch, unemployment went up. Under our watch, Mr Speaker, unemployment fell, Mr Speaker, to 4%. And, Mr Speaker, those investments we're making, those investments in the skills, in the infrastructure, in the affordable and reliable energy, in making things in this country, Mr Speaker, in manufacturing and in particular in our regions. Mr Speaker, tonight you'll see an investment in our regions that no government has ever had the ambition to embark on, which will transform our regions and ensure that the wealth of our regions is unlocked, so we can invest in the essential services that Australians rely on at record levels, and we can keep Australians safe, Mr Speaker.
Order.
A stronger economy
The Prime
means a
Minister's
stronger
time
future.
has expired. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is also to the Minister for Veterans Affairs, and I refer to his previous answer. In that answer, the Minister just said that the backlog of unprocessed veterans' claims has been, to quote him, building up for years. Given this government has been in office for almost a decade, who is responsible for that backlog building up for years? And are the funds actually in the budget or in the contingency reserve?
The Minister has the call.
Thank you. I thank the Leader of the Opposition. Well,
The Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, the responsibility to deal with the unacceptably high backlog of claims— Well, Mr Speaker, I ask that you bring the House to order.
Order. Members on my left. Members on my left.
Mr Speaker.
I haven't given you the call yet. Members on my left. Member for Solomon. The Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, the responsibility for clearing that unacceptably high backlog of claims rests with me. It's my job to clear it up, and I have to clear it up for veterans, and I have to clear it up for ADF personnel, and I have to clear it up for their families. That is my responsibility, and it's a responsibility that I take very seriously. That's why I wanted the $96 million to back the action plan, to do something about it, to give me the tools and the funding that I need to get that job done. And I don't apologise for it. I don't apologise for it today. I'm not going to apologise for what I said. I stand by everything I said, and I stand by everything I did. As far as the funding goes, Mr Speaker, there is $22.8 million as a line item in the budget, and the balance of just over 73 is in the contingency reserve, which is also part of the budget. So the funding is there, Mr Speaker. And Mr Speaker, it's my job to represent veterans, and I'm satisfied that the funding is there. I've seen the paperwork, and the $96 million is going to make a difference to clearing up that backlog of claims. And I stand by everything I said and everything I did, and I'll do it all again tomorrow for the veterans.
The member for Dawson has the call.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister. Following the announcements of the Urana and Hells Gates dams, will the Deputy Prime Minister outline to the House why delivering for regional economies is so important to grow the nation as strong as possible, as quickly as possible? Is the Deputy Prime Minister aware of any alternative policies?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Well, Mr Deputy Speaker, I thank the honourable member for Dawson for his question, and note that the member for Dawson is retiring at this election. And if there's one thing we all note, whether you like him or not, he has certainly not been a shadow of a person. He has been a person of incredibly strong views. He is an absolute compass on what he has done, and he has shown to us that he has the courage to stand behind his views, and I commend him for that, and I commend him for the work that he's done for the people of Dawson. Mr Speaker, he raises the question of the substantial investment that this government has made in dams. In Hells Gate Dam, $5.4 billion that we have put on the table for a dam that the Labor Party—
Member for Chifley.
The Labor Party has said at the state level that it was of critical importance. It was also an election promise. All the Labor Party has to do now is say the word yes, that they're going to do it. But of course we haven't got yes. What we're getting is excuses, and excuses that are driven by their attachment to the Greens. Because it shows you it is a Green Labor government. A Green Labor government, and when push comes to shove, they will not build a thing because they're tied to the Greens. And Uranidam, here's Uranidam. Their candidate, Michael Brunker, has said that Anastasia Palaszczuk-led government will support Uranidam. We announced the money. We can't wait for the state government. Private enterprise is putting in money, and guess what? They're not supporting it. They're not supporting it. Paradise Dam. Well, they built it. It fell over. We had to build it again. But did we quibble about it? No, because we believe in the infrastructure that makes our nation as strong as possible. And even though we're coming from a strong position, we're a strong nation becoming stronger, and we have to. We are fully aware of the circumstances that are before this nation. They are evident on the television every night. They are evident on the reports that come to us on things that are happening in our region of the Pacific. So this government is focusing on how we make the money to keep our nation strong. It is not good enough just to say you believe in a strong defence force as the Labor Party does. We're actually showing you how you build your nation so you can pay for it. We are building our nation so we can support the NDIS. We are building our nation so we can support Medicare. We are building our nation by making the hard decisions to grow where we know we have opportunities. Mr Speaker, it is people such as the member for Dawson, it is people such as the member for Capricornia, it is people such as the members in Central Queensland and those who stand behind the industry of Central New South Wales that makes our nation as strong as possible.
Deputy Prime Minister's time has expired. I give the call to the Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question's to the Prime Minister. If the Prime Minister cared about cost of living pressures for working families, why has he spent a decade undermining real wage growth and job security?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, I completely reject the assertion made by the Leader of the Opposition, Mr Speaker, at the dispatch box, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, had we still had the same tax rates for personal income today that we had when we inherited and were elected to office, Mr Speaker, back in 2013 by those opposite, if we still had Labor's tax rates today and we hadn't embarked on the process of tax reform so Australians could keep more of what they earn, Mr Speaker, then someone on $90,000 today, Mr Speaker, would be paying more than $50 extra every week in tax. $50 a week extra in tax every single week. If we kept Labor's tax rates, Mr Speaker, that's what would have happened. Under Labor, if we kept those tax rates, people would be paying higher taxes and higher taxes and higher taxes, because you know what you get from Labor? Higher taxes, Mr Speaker. That's what we know from the Labor Party. Now, Mr Speaker, on Thursday night, the Leader of the Opposition will have the opportunity to put their alternative budget, Mr Speaker, to what we are putting forward tonight. And I look forward to hearing, because they've had 3 years, Mr Speaker, to ponder what their alternative budget would be. They say, Mr Speaker—
The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Yes, Mr Speaker. He's halfway through, the Prime Minister is through this answer. He hasn't mentioned real wage growth or job security, which is what the question was about. I know they haven't got much to say about it.
The Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. The Prime Minister has been dealing with tax rates. The Prime Minister is in order and has the call. The Manager of Opposition Business. On a point of order.
Yeah, just to clarify the ruling. Have you just ruled the Prime Minister is in order because he's talking about something that wasn't in the question?
No. The member for Solomon. No. Member for Solomon, I won't tolerate reflecting on the chair. Member for Solomon is warned. The Prime Minister has been referring to tax rates, which are clearly the Prime Minister, in my view, is in order. He's being relevant to the question, and he has the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So I look forward to hearing what we might come from the Leader of the Opposition on Thursday on these matters, Mr. Speaker, because, Mr. Speaker, there's not a lot for them to say when it comes to these issues, but this is what we can say. We can say, Mr. Speaker, that under our government, electricity prices have fallen by 8% in the last 2 years. Under our government, we can say, Mr. Speaker, that to deal with the rising costs of living, we've been getting Australians into jobs at record rates. Unemployment has fallen to 4%. Even the Reserve Bank Governor, Mr. Speaker, has highlighted how wages are set to rise, Mr. Speaker, as a result of the pressures in the labour market, because we're running a strong economy. The best remedy, Mr. Speaker, for higher wages is a stronger economy. And the way you get that stronger economy, Mr. Speaker, is the responsible economic policies that has seen our government oversee an economy that has outperformed the advanced world, Mr. Speaker, throughout this pandemic, where unemployment has fallen from 5.7% under Labor down to 4% under Liberals and Nationals, and that unemployment figure is falling further still. So, Mr. Speaker, our record of getting Australians into jobs, our record of getting Australians into homes, our record of getting electricity prices down to ease the cost of living, and our record, Mr. Speaker, of addressing these urgent issues, Mr. Speaker, is there for all to see, and it's a good record. Mr. Speaker, they say they're going to have a mini-budget, Mr. Speaker.
Order. The Prime Minister's time has expired, and I give the call to the member for Clark.
Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister, imagine being under the control of a state-appointed guardian or public trustee and not being allowed to grab an iced coffee for a treat or buy presents for the grandkids or to replace your ill-fitting underwear. Sadly, this is the reality for many Australians. No wonder a Tasmanian inquiry concluded that the public trustee misunderstood their duties for the last 26 years. Or that Four Corners recently documented a number of injustices inflicted by public trustees across Australia. Prime Minister, do you agree that it's an inherent right to exercise as much control over your life as possible? And will you help develop a new national framework for supported decision-making?
The Prime Minister has
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member for his question on the broad principle. Of course, we want Australians to have the life of their choice and the best possible life they can have, Mr. Speaker. But I'll ask the Minister representing the Attorney-General to deal specifically with the matters that you've raised.
The Minister has the call.
Well, I do thank the member for Clark for the question. I thank the Prime Minister for the opportunity to expand on what the Prime Minister has already said to the House. The Morrison government, of course, strongly supports the right of individuals to exercise legal capacity. Where an individual requires support to exercise this capacity, it should be subject to appropriate safeguards to ensure that no abuse, exploitation or neglect occurs. Now, the effective regulation of public trustees, which are creatures of state government, is therefore a matter primarily for state and territory governments. That being said, Commonwealth agencies do have a role to play in setting appropriate standards for the delivery of services to the Australian community. In that regard, the National Disability Insurance Agency recently commenced consultations on a new support for decision-making policy for the National Disability Insurance Scheme, and the government looks forward to the progress of this important work.
The member for Braddon has the call.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Defence. Will the Minister update the House on the Morrison government's commitment in ensuring that the Australian Defence Force has the resources and the personnel that it needs in order to keep Australia safe and secure, and is the Minister aware of any alternative policies? Minister.
I haven't given you the call yet. Member for Wills. The Minister for Defence has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I want to say thank you very much to the member for Braddon for the support that he provides to the Australian Defence Force and acknowledge his own service in uniform to our country. Mr Speaker, we know that our nation faces a set of geopolitical circumstances and challenges and threats on a scale and complexity that we haven't seen since the Second World War. Everybody has been watching the unfolding scenes in Europe, in the Ukraine, with a fear that it could spread to other countries, to NATO countries, and what that would mean for Europe and indeed what it would mean for the rest of the world. And, Mr Speaker, people have been shocked by the relationship between China and Russia, and people rightly are worried about China's own ambition within our region, within the Indo-Pacific. And so, Mr Speaker, we have been determined to do all that we can not to take peace for granted. And I think all Australians realise that we are in a very different world now than we were 5 or 10 years ago. And that's why it's been essential for the Australian government, for the Morrison government, to strengthen the Australian Defence Force, to announce, Mr Speaker, that we will increase the number of ADF personnel by over 30% to a total permanent force of about 80,000 people, and overall Defence's total permanent workforce will increase to over 101,000, an increase of 18,500 over the baseline growth already agreed in 2020. Now, Mr Speaker, we have, over the course of the last 8 years, gone about making sure that we fix up Labor's mess in Defence and the national security agencies. Mr Speaker, the reality is that Labor ripped money out of Defence, they ripped money out of ASIO, they ripped money out of the Australian Federal Police, they ripped money out of ASIS, Mr Speaker, and we were not the strong country that we needed to be when it came to the Australian Defence Force, Mr Speaker. We know that one of the most shameful attributes of the Rudd-Albanese period in government, Mr Speaker, was to reduce spending as a percentage of GDP to 1.56%, the lowest level, Mr Speaker, since 1938. Mr Speaker, it was a shocking time for Defence and for the men and women of the ADF.
The Minister will resume his seat. The Deputy Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Yes, it is a point of order, Mr Speaker. It's irony. This is coming from the government, which
the Deputy Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. The Deputy Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. The Minister has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. That was more a job advertisement. What about poor old Brendan O'Connor? I mean, have you ever heard of him? What's he going to do? What's he going to do?
The Minister will resume his seat. The Manager of Opposition Business on a point. Well, before I give the
job that you want,
the Minister will resume his seat. I'm not going to call you. The Minister for Defence. The Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
Yeah, Mr Speaker, the Leader of the House is out of order and knows he's out of order when he makes those comments, and it's a deliberate flouting of the rules of the House.
The Defence Minister has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Look, the reality is that if we had continued defence spending at the same levels that Labor had when they were last in government, we would be spending, Mr Speaker, $55 billion less on defence over the course of the last 8 years. So what does that mean, Mr Speaker? It means that men and women of the Australian Defence Force would be looking for other jobs. We would have reduced numbers, Mr Speaker, because that's what Labor did when they were in government. Mr Speaker,
order.
That is the reality of the Labor Party.
The Minister's time has expired, and I give the call to the member for Richmond.
My question is to the Prime Minister. New South Wales Liberal MP Catherine Cusack said, "The idea that being a flood victim in a National Party-held seat makes you more worthy than a flood victim who is in the Richmond electorate is probably the most unethical approach I have ever seen." Why did it take the resignation of Ms Cusack for the Prime Minister to act on flood relief for the people in my electorate?
Thank you. Just the Prime Minister, just before I give you the call, I would ask all members of the House to please just keep the interjections down. The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Richmond for a question, and I commend her for the work she's been doing in her local community over the course of the floods, Mr Speaker, as I remarked in my earlier statements on indulgence. Now, Mr Speaker, I don't agree with the views of Ms Cusack. I've known Ms Cusack for a long time. I don't agree with her views, but I do understand that in the middle of floods and the terrible circumstances of what have caught in the Northern Rivers, Mr Speaker, is that people were under enormous stress. But, Mr Speaker, as the member for Richmond would know, because I spoke to the member for Richmond when I was in the Northern Rivers, Mr Speaker, and what was being referred to was the extension of the payments from the 3 local government areas in Lismore, Clarence Valley and Richmond Valley, which were giving triple payments on the disaster payment, Mr Speaker. I spoke to the member for Richmond on the day that that was announced, and I told her that the further assessments were being done on other local government areas in that region, and once those assessments were complete, then a further decision would be made. Now, Mr Speaker, that was before the statements made by Ms Cusack. She may not have been aware, even though that position had been made public. Mr Speaker, I spoke to the Mayor of Ballina on that same day after I'd been speaking to the member for Richmond, and I'd made it very clear that these other assessments were being undertaken. And, Mr Speaker, those disaster payments, the triple payments, which are very rare, they've never been done before, Mr Speaker, but in recognition and because of the strong work done, Mr Speaker, by members, and particularly the member for Page as well, we, Mr Speaker, extended those payments to 7 local government areas. Now, in the members' electorate in Ballina, and the local government area of Ballina and Byron, Mr Speaker, there have been some $33 million in payments already made, Mr Speaker, to some 20,000 people, Mr Speaker. Some 20,000 people, Mr Speaker. And we are pleased that we will be able to get—
The Prime Minister will resume his seat. Look, I understand these things are obviously very emotional, but I'm going to warn the member for Richmond. The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. So in those 2 local government areas alone, some 20,000 individuals are receiving 3 payments, Mr Speaker, and the average payment to a household in those areas affected, that would mean a payment of around $7,000 directly, Mr Speaker, to support those most devastated in those flood areas. So, Mr Speaker, when I went to the Northern Rivers, I made it very clear that we're making the announcements on those first 3, and as is often the case with all disaster payments, assessments are made and additional local government areas are added as those assessments are completed. I made that very clear to the member for Richmond, and Mr Speaker, and when we, Mr Speaker, had done those proper assessments by agencies, we extended those payments. And I'm pleased we have, Mr Speaker. I'm very pleased we have, and I'm pleased the assessments supported us doing that. And this is part already of a commitment in New South Wales alone of some $2.1 billion that we directly have committed, Mr Speaker, as a federal government. And $1.3 million, Mr Speaker, or thereabouts, is already out the door.
Prime Minister's
supporting
time
Australians
has
affected
expired,
by the flood.
and I give the call to the member for Boothby.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for the Environment, representing the Minister for Women. Would the Minister please outline to the House how the Morrison government is supporting the more than 800,000 Australian women and girls living with endometriosis, including me, as I discovered to my shock in early 2020 after years of advocacy for everyone affected by endo?
The Minister has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Can I thank the member for Boothby for her question, and particularly thank her for her advocacy for women struggling with this dreadful condition, something that she was doing so many years before she received her own shocking diagnosis of stage 4 endometriosis. Mr Speaker, around 1 in 9 Australian women suffer from endometriosis. It's a painful and debilitating condition, and like the member for Boothby, they face it with incredible bravery because it just has such a significant impact on their health, their mental health, their family, their work, their education, their participation in all kinds of social activities, starting often as a teenager, affecting you in your school years and on through your adult life. And while it's a highly individualised condition, common symptoms include pelvic pain that often puts life on hold once every month and also can impact fertility. Now, this government launched the first ever National Action Plan for endometriosis in July 2018 to support improved treatment, understanding and awareness of this condition. And since the release of our National Action Plan, we've committed $22.5 million for awareness, education, clinical management, care and research. And as part of tonight's budget, there will be an additional $58 million allocated to support women with endometriosis, including $16 million for new specialised endometriosis and pelvic pain clinics in each state and territory, $25 million to support women with severe endometriosis and other conditions that affect fertility, so they can access a new Medicare-funded MRI scan. More funding, Mr Speaker, for an endometriosis management plan that supports patients in primary care, a digital platform providing access to the best information, a national endometriosis clinical and scientific trials network, and funding to increase awareness and education, and a workplace assistance program so more people can understand how you have discussions about this in the workplace. Mr Speaker, our plan, now over $80 million, will improve the quality of life for women with endometriosis. And people who listen to conversations about the budget often deal with that in terms of strong, responsible economic management, and they might not immediately think of measures for women's health. But, Mr Speaker, I do, we do, because it's measures like this that reflect the approach the Morrison government is taking to this budget. A strong economy guarantees essential services, such as the PBS, where we can list new treatments for ovarian cancer, for breast cancer. That responsible economic management affects all Australians, particularly women.
The member for Lilly has the call.
My question is to the Prime Minister. The Schlegel family in my electorate of Lilly lost their business and 90% of their possessions in the February floods. They're currently living in a rental caravan with their remaining possessions in boxes. Why does the Schlegel family deserve only 1/3 of the Australian government disaster relief payment that a resident in New South Wales receives?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. In Queensland, the government has already committed to phase 1 of the disaster recovery funding arrangements on the proposal put forward to us by the Queensland government. That comprised $558.5 million, funded 50-50. We are currently working through the second phase of that program. That first wave of the program provides some $250 million in primary producer grants, $257.5 million in small business and not-for-profit grants, sports and recreational assets, some $32 million and $1 million grants going to the affected local government areas. On top of that, Mr Speaker, the Queensland government are providing assistance under the disaster recovery funding arrangements under Category A and B for 23 local government areas. Personal hardship assistance is available under that program. The payments of the disaster recovery payment and the disaster recovery allowance are available right across all Queensland local government areas, Mr Speaker. A judgment was made by our advisors, Mr Speaker, at the Disaster Recovery and Resilience Agency that the scale of the flood, Mr Speaker, the scale of the flood in the Northern Rivers, which was a 1 in 500-year flood, and, Mr Speaker, as difficult and as challenging as the flood has been in many areas. In Hawkesbury, Mr Speaker, another area of New South Wales that was affected by the floods, or parts of Queensland, particularly up in Gympie, Mr Speaker, or Maryborough, or parts of Queensland. The scale of the flood compared to the scale of the flood experienced in the Northern Rivers, Mr Speaker, is materially different. And the disaster recovery payment arrangements that have always been provided in all floods, Mr Speaker, in all bushfires, in all of these circumstances, the decision was taken to provide assistance above and beyond the normal responses to floods for the Northern Rivers because it was a 1 in 500-year flood, and that was some more than 2 metres higher than the highest flood ever experienced in the Northern Rivers. It was an inland tsunami, Mr Speaker, so we were pleased to provide. It's almost been now some $1 billion in Queensland to support flood assistance and relief to households and individuals through the ADF, Mr Speaker, who did a sterling job out of the barracks there in Enoggera. I want to commend all the members, Mr Speaker, for their work in supporting their communities throughout the Queensland floods, and we will continue in our assessments of the further package that we're discussing with the Queensland Government now, Mr Speaker. But national disasters, Mr Speaker, are no place for partisan politics. They're a place for support together, Mr Speaker, and these things should not be made a function of partisan contest.
The member for Robertson has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and my question is to the Minister for Health and Aged Care. Will the Minister please update the House on how and why the Morrison government is supporting access to life-saving medicines, including for Australians living with cystic fibrosis, and is the Minister aware of any alternative policies?
The Minister has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank the member for Robertson. On Sunday I had the privilege of meeting Jess Ragusa from the member's electorate, indeed I think from Copacabana, and Jess has been an advocate for better access to better treatments for cystic fibrosis. She is a sufferer herself, and she said very simply that with the listing of Trikafta, a medicine for 1,900 patients which will save approximately $250,000 per patient, she and her husband can now plan on having a child. Her life will be extended, her quality of life will be improved, her capacity to have a child is now secure. And alongside other patients who were there on Sunday, such as Kai and 11-year-old Heidi, and Sarah, who's a Year 11 student from the Mornington Peninsula, all of these patients with cystic fibrosis have a better chance of a longer life and a better life. And as we look across the last few years, we have been able to progressively list new medicines for cystic fibrosis, such as Kalydeco, Symdeko, Orkambi and now Trikafta, a $250,000 medicine, which is something we can do because we believe in it, because we can fund it and because we are committed to it. And as a result of that, we've seen over 2,800 new or amended medicines listed during the life of this government. We have seen the listing times more than half, from 312 days to 141 days over the course of the life of this government. And we have committed to listing every medicine that the Pharmaceutical Benefit Advisory Committee approves. Sadly, we know that that has not always been the case. In 2011, the previous government refused to list the medicines that were approved by the PBAC, and that included Symbicort for other respiratory conditions, in particular asthma and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. It is my hope and my belief that such a time never happens again during our lives and during the course.
Yes, the Minister will resume his seat. The member for Macarthur on a point of order.
Mr Chair, the medicines that the Minister is talking about, Symbicort, there are many alternatives to it. It wasn't a life-saving medication.
The member for Macarthur.
There is no comparison
the
with the
member for
Trikafta, which
will
is bipartisan.
resume his seat. The Minister has the call.
Well, there you go, Mr Speaker. No repentance on their side for stopping the medicines. But let me say this. I will finish with a message I received today about why we do these things. From a friend who said, I have a close friend with a 23-year-old son with cystic fibrosis. My friend and her family have not slept since the Trikafta announcement. For their son Ben, this drug will hopefully mean a chance to live his life rather than await an early death. That is why we do what we do.
The member for Griffith.
Yes, thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The Khan family, who live in an apartment complex in my electorate, applied for disaster payments when their basement was flooded and they were without power for 27 days. The Khan family says one family member received the payment, but others had their applications rejected. How can one member of the same family living in the same apartment be eligible for flood relief payments, but the others be rejected?
The Prime Minister has a call.
Speaker, I'd be very happy to receive the details of the matter which the member has raised and have that taken up by Services Australia, Mr Speaker. In the course of these floods lately, Mr Speaker, over these last few weeks, $1.3 billion has been paid to over 1.4 million Australians. Mr Speaker, and particularly in relation to the Queensland floods. As I mentioned when I was in Brisbane at the time, and I want to thank Premier Palaszczuk for the close cooperation we've had on dealing with the issues with the Queensland floods. Particularly in relation to Queensland, when you go back to the 2011 floods, the then Prime Minister Gillard turned out the Australian Defence Forces and the support that was there with the then Premier Bligh at the time worked together, Mr Speaker, together with the Brisbane City Council to ensure there was an effective response. Mr Speaker, what I can say is they used everything at their disposal, but because of what we've been able to build up since 2011 in the Brisbane floods, we turned out four times the amount of ADF response, and we did it almost a week earlier than occurred on that occasion. So I'd be very happy, Mr Speaker, to receive the details of the individual case that you're raising. I'd be happy to have that taken up by the Minister. But as I've said, Mr Speaker, 1.4 million Australians have received assistance to the tune of $1.3 billion. And that is what has gone out over the course of these floods, Mr Speaker, over the recent weeks in which they've been experiencing them. And I want to thank the staff at Services Australia for turning out in large numbers and those who have come from other departments to help process those calls. They have been getting to their task to help as many Australians as they possibly can. And I commend them for their work, Mr Speaker, and I'd call on all members of this House to thank Services Australia staff for doing such a great job in this crisis.
The member for Lindsay has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Assistant Treasurer, Minister for Housing, Minister for Homelessness, Social and Community Housing. Will the Minister update the House on how the Morrison government's home guarantee schemes will accelerate the dream of home ownership for even more Australians?
The Assistant Treasurer has the call.
Well, thanks very much, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the member for Lindsay for her question and commend the member for Lindsay for being a champion for first home buyers in her electorate. And I've enjoyed visiting all of the first home buyers in the Lindsay electorate, many of whom have already used the home guarantee scheme to purchase a new home. We took to the last election a commitment to help first home buyers purchase a home with a deposit of 5%, because we know the biggest challenge for first home buyers is getting into that home and saving what the banks are requiring, which is a 20% deposit. So the home guarantee scheme that we put in place in 2020 has already led to 60,000 first home buyers purchasing their first home with a deposit of as little as 5%. We've expanded the scheme to include single parents with the family home guarantee to assist single parents purchase a home with a deposit of as little as 2%. The great success of these schemes has led to first home buyers being at their highest levels for nearly 15 years. In fact, in the last financial year, when we see the long-run average of first home buyers sitting at around 100 to 110,000 a year, in the last financial year we have helped and insured 177,000 first home buyers were able to get into their first home. It wasn't just the home guarantee scheme, or important though that was, and that is what has justified now a major expansion of the scheme. We announced yesterday, and the Treasurer will formally announce tonight in the budget, that the home guarantee scheme now will be expanded to 50,000 places per annum. 50,000 people who will be able to purchase a home with a reduced deposit. 35,000 places for first-home buyers to purchase a home with a 5% deposit. 5,000 places every year for single parents, 84% of which are single mothers, to purchase a home
with a deposit of 2%, and 10,000 places set aside for people to build or to buy a new home in a regional area. 50,000 places each and every year. The Labor Party mocked our home guarantee scheme when we announced it. The Leader of the Opposition opposed the home builder grant, $25,000 grants, which has contributed to the first home buyer levels we've seen. In fact, the Leader of the Opposition said that the home builder grant would fund gold taps and pearl baths, where there are more than 150,000 people who have built modest new homes, first home buyers, who would be utterly shocked to think that the Leader of the Opposition is suggesting that they have gold taps in their bathrooms. This Leader of the Opposition does not stand for first home buyers. The government is a government for first home buyers and will continue to be.
The Minister's time has expired. The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper.